Ja, korrekt, ja.
Ja.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear President Yushchenko, Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear colleagues of the AIES, dear AIES board members, dear friends. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you officially to the 29th European Forum Vienna. This forum takes place at challenging times, at complex times, and to be very frank, at dire times. We're faced with the continuation of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. We're faced with rising geopolitical tensions, as well as the dramatic surge of multifaceted hybrid threats, unconventional threats that are happening each day that are also affecting us in Europe and in Austria. And these developments remind us that it's our shared responsibility to address and overcome the challenges of today. It's our shared responsibility here in Austria, but also in Europe, to take decisive actions to secure our democracies and to safeguard our sovereignty. Therefore, the 29th European Forum Vienna stands under the main theme, Europe's new responsibility. At the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, we firmly believe that organizing this forum for the 29th time, we are not only providing a platform for dialogue and discussion to raise awareness about these very pressing issues, but we're also contributing for solutions here. And we'd like to emphasize this year, in particular, this shared responsibility that we all have to address these challenges. Ladies and gentlemen, exactly for that reason, we decided to kick off the European Forum today with the discussion War in Europe, Status Quo, and Future Perspectives, providing a comprehensive overview of the current developments and the most pressing security challenges for Europe. As you have probably seen, the program is continuing tomorrow. Tomorrow's program will feature exceptional high-level speakers and panelists who will present a deep dive into the European security and defense architecture, into current initiative, future strategies, and present also views from different European capitals. If you haven't signed up for tomorrow's program, you're of course also most welcome to join us. Before I hand over the floor to our AIES President, Dr. Werner Fasslabend, I would also like to seize the opportunity to thank our partners and supporters without whom this forum would certainly not have been possible, especially the Vienna School of International Studies, which venue we are using yet another time. We have organized all European forums that I can think of here in the Vienna School of International Studies, but also the Wilfried Martens Center, the Campus Tivoli, the European Security Defense College, and also our strategic partners who help and support our various initiatives, the Ministry of European and International Affairs, the Austrian Ministry of Defense, and also Land Niederösterreich for their valuable support. If you would also like to support us, or if you would like to find out more about our work, you can do so using those QR codes. We would very much appreciate it. Thank you very much for coming. I wish you a very interested and timely debate, and I would like to invite Dr. Fasslabend to take the floor. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. President, dear Commissioner and former Foreign Minister, dear former Minister for Defense, Excellencies, Generals, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to have the opportunity to moderate a panel with, let me say, not only the best known, but also the best commentator on the warfare you can find in German-speaking countries and beyond. Because not only when I come to any place in Germany, but also in any place in Europe, people would ask me about this officer, Rise, something with Rise or so. And he really is not only a commentator, but just let me say a few words about the person. Markus Reisner, he was born in the town, in the city, you have to say, where also our military academy is situated in Wiener Neustadt. And therefore, it is not a miracle that he became an officer. And he did his job not only very well, but made practice in many countries of the world, not only in Bosnia and in Kosovo, but also in Chad and Central African Republic, in Afghanistan and Iraq. So far, he really has an immense international experience. He had, of course, many functions. One of the last one was he used to be the commander of our National Guard, not of the National Guard, of the Guard troops, of the Guard battalion. And now he is at the military academy, responsible for the education and the training of our future officers. This certainly is an excellent place for him. And now I do not ask any questions. You know the title. The title was War in Europe, Status Quo, and Future Perspectives. And now I just ask him to tell us a little bit, not only a little bit, but go into the depth of this agenda. Please, Colonel of General Staff, Markus Reisner.
Thanks a lot for your really kind words. Dear distinguished guests, I have the honor again actually to give you a brief on the situation of the war in Europe. And of course this is about Ukraine and it's about the hybrid war we are facing at the moment. I have brought a nice slide pack for you. All the slides are in English, so quite easy to follow through the slides. First of all, I would like to stress the following. We are really facing serious times. You might not think that is really the case, but it is the case. We are in historical times, and no one can tell you what the future will bring and what will be the outcome. Everyone who tells you that this and this will happen is very likely wrong, but unfortunately the historians will tell you after everything has happened why it was absolutely clear that it happened exactly in that way. And as I'm a historian on my own, I can agree not very much on that too. So the topic of our brief today is the winter is coming. It's two parts actually. The first is about Ukraine, the global situation a little bit, and the second one is about the hybrid warfare we are facing in Europe. As you can see, there is another headline here, the failure of the Russian summer offensive. Yes, the Russians have failed again this year in summer, but unfortunately we have lost another city, in that case Pokrovsk, which has fallen into Russian hands. It's not completely lost already, but it's pretty much on the way to be lost, I would say. Okay, so as you all know, it's now the fourth year of the war, and it's often very difficult to explain in simple words what happened in all these 4 years. And I would use the following metaphor. As you all know, boxing. I think the one or other of you might have a little bit of interest in boxing. As you know, there are two opponents in the boxing ring fighting a boxing match, and it's going round after round. So what we see in Ukraine is exactly that. We are now in round number 8, and we have seen that the favorite, the Russian side, the Russian boxer, have failed in the beginning, but this boxing is going round after round, and we see more and more that the Russian fighter is actually following the strategy of attrition. And that is very important to understand, because if you look at the Russian fighter, and you might know him, it's Valuyev. He has won all these fights not by tactics, techniques, or procedures, no, just because of his mass, because he just put his weight on the opponent, and this is why most of the fights he actually won, exactly 48 of 50. On the other side, you have a very agile young person, in that case a British person, Hay, who is one of two who won a fight against the Russian boxer named Valuev, but only because of the fact that in the beginning, in the first rounds, he was able to inflict heavily hits on Valuev. But now the problem is that we see more and more that it looks like that the huge Russian boxer is becoming more and more the momentum. And as you all know, it's not about the boxer on their own, but every round ends, and then you have to go back into the corner, and who waits in the corner? Your trainer, your supporters. And this is very important because it's not that Ukraine is fighting against Russia alone. No, it's Russia and its supporters. And this is very, very important because in the Russian corner, you will find China, for example, you will find India, you will find North Korea, you will find Iran, you will find sometimes Turkey, and you will find some other nations of the so-called global south, and that makes a big difference. On the other side, also the Ukrainians find some assistance. The Ukrainian boxer in his corner, you will find the Europeans, a lot of ideas, but nothing in their pockets left actually. And the Americans who obviously are not really interested anymore in what's going on in the boxing ring. And that makes a big difference. So just to put that in the front. And when you look a little bit through the newspapers, then you can see that the support is fading away, especially from the Europeans. And there was a very good article just recently in the NZZ, which stated very clear that actually the support is becoming lower and lower, and you all know what is actually happening when it comes to Trump. On the other side, when it comes to resources, there are a lot of countries who still consume a lot of resources from Russia, and that makes, of course, a difference. I think you all have heard about the Shadow Fleet, and the Shadow Fleet makes a difference to the situation, as I have told you before. Well, phase number 8 was starting with the inauguration of Trump. Everyone hoped for a huge pressure from Trump against the Russians, but it hasn't happened. So there were no peace talks until today. There was a huge summit in Alaska, but the outcome was not the one we all desired. We see that Russia is recovering. There are very good actually articles about the way the Russians are doing this. I'm just referring to the one from their mascot, or this one is also a very good one. Or if you have time, look out for the articles from the Royal United Service Institute, RUSI. They have very good articles about the situation, how it looks like really behind the scenes. But altogether, you can see that the Russians are more and more gaining the momentum. And when you look in their corner, then you can see actually that it looks like we have seen in Tianjin, that the global south is getting more and more together and actually making the difference. You just have to look sometimes on X, what is written there, like Modi, who saying, okay, well, we're on the right way. And of course, one of the most important things we have seen just recently was the visit of the Chinese foreign minister in Europe, when he talked to Mrs. Callas and said, we have no interest that Russia is losing actually the fight, because if Russia is losing the fight, then maybe we will face the United States, and this is something we don't want to have. So, I mean, it's very clearly said by the Chinese, so I don't know why there are still people who are wondering about the things which are happening, actually. And you know, the Chinese have a lot of different assets they can use. If it's, as you know, the situation concerning the rare earths situation, then of course you have heard about Nexperia, or again, rare earths, and that makes a big difference also here. So you can see that maybe China, Russia, Korea, Iran are not liking each other very much, but they have a common enemy, and that's us. So we have to face that situation. Now let's look at the situation in Ukraine in detail. Let's start with the strategic level, then go to the operational and then to the tactical level. On the strategic level, you see that the Russians have started just recently their next strategic air campaign, especially during winter time. This is happening because they want to destroy pretty much the critical infrastructure when it comes to electricity and when it comes to gas supplies. You see here from the Institute of the Study of War that from month to month we see more assets from the Russian side which they use against the Ukrainians, if it's drones, if it's cruise missiles, if it's rockets. And it's especially cheap drones of the type Garand 2, Garand 3, and strategic bombers, which they use for actually to come up with their cruise missiles who make the difference. And you can see here that the Ukrainians already struggle actually to fight against those assets because they're coming in more and more. And the Russians are following the strategy of saturation. And that, of course, makes it very difficult for the Ukrainians. And as you can see, there are still possibilities for the Russians to escalate the situation even further, especially when you look at the power plants along the Dnieper River. And you can also see that the production rates are very high. It's said that up to 80,000 drones alone are produced this year, which are used from the Russians against the Ukrainians. And you can also see here in the video that the drones are hitting their targets. And that, of course, makes it very complicated for the Ukrainians because the Russians changed their tactics. Drones are coming in very low, going up into a steep angle and coming down 10 to 12 at one target. And you might hit 6 or 8 of them, but the rest is hitting the target. And that makes it very, very difficult. And here are the numbers which I have said before. From the Ukrainian side, up to 80,000 Shahid-type drones, which are used in addition to up to 1,500 rockets, and in addition to the cruise missiles, which are a topic. Well, the Ukrainians try to do their best to secure the critical infrastructure, but it's becoming more and more difficult for them, and especially this winter will be very hard. I know we heard that already last year, and it's unbelievable what the Ukrainians managed to do last winter, but this winter again will be very hard. So you have to understand, if you don't help the Ukrainians, especially through that winter, it might be very difficult. And again, you see here that the Russians, we have, as you all know, 19 sanction packages, but still the Russians are able to produce rockets, for example, cruise missiles at high numbers. So the number is up to 1,500 at least once a year, and that makes, again, a big difference. The good message here is that the Ukrainians try to bring the war back to Russia. So there's also a strategic air campaign of the Ukrainians against the Russians, but the saturating effect is still not in that level actually where it should be. You see that they're hitting their targets, especially when it comes to oil and gas production, and they have changed the targeting at the moment to electricity, which is very important. But the question is, are they fast enough? Can we measure already these results? Or are the Russians more faster than the Ukrainians? And you also see that there is assistance, even if it's in a hidden way, from the Americans when it comes to targeting. And this is also important because the Americans are very careful when it comes to the way they do it, because they want to avoid any escalation. This is very important, especially when you look at the presidencies of Biden and also of Trump. There are things done, but in a way that you have to be careful. Why? Because if it's too escalating, the Russians can also escalate. And we had this already twice during the war. The second time was this incident. If you might remember, that was the case when the Americans started to target Russian targets on Russian soil related to the Kursk offensive. What the Russians did is actually they used a rocket of the type of Oreshnik to show everyone what they can actually do. And they also came up with several hybrid attacks. And what was the result? Immediately, the Americans stopped the targeting of Russian targets on Russian soil. And this is what happened very clearly. That was not the first time, but also here we see that there is an assistance. And also here, if you just look through the slide here, then you can see that they are very careful when it comes to targeting. They even changed the word target to points of interest, or tracks of interest, to avoid that someone actually can blame them for what they do actually. But don't get me wrong, the same is done also by the Chinese, for example, as you might noticed just recently. And also here Trump said very clearly it's not true that they are doing what they do, but it is like I've told you. And why is it so important? Because there was the first incident, and I think I have told you that once before. That was in summer 2022. When the Russians really were cornered. That was the chance of the war, actually, summer 2022, not April or May, it was the summer of 2022. And we know that the Russians were thinking, or at least considering, to use tactical nuclear weapons to solve a tactical situation in Kherson region. And there was a back channel communication going on with the use of the Chinese and India to avoid anything like that from the American side. And we know this very well because of several books which already exist. I recommend really the book of Bob Woodward, where you can have a very clear understanding what was going on. But also here, what happened was what I call the Russian Dunkirk. So the Russians were able to go on the other side of the Dnieper, and nothing really bad happened to them. And so you were able to see that there are these hidden elephants in the room, and that there is this strategy to boil the frog on a very low level and not to escalate the situation. And the same we have at the moment, because you might have heard about the discussion referring to the Tomahawks, and should we deliver Tomahawks or not? I mean, the Americans, should they deliver Tomahawks or not? And out of the sudden, you hear a lot about nuclear saber rattling. For example, there is the Stormbird, the new nuclear-powered atomic cruise missile from the Russians, and the Poseidon, and there is a submarine who can carry 6 Poseidons, and so on and so on. You might laugh a little bit about it, but it is a topic which is the elephant in the room, which we have to consider, especially when it comes to the point what the Americans are doing, and if there is the question if we really should or can go in or not. And also here, I just would like to refer to Trump and what he says. I think he's very honest in what he says here. It's not his war. So we also have to understand it is the Americans who are making the difference. We Europeans have no really military assets which we can use and bring on the table. So the kingmaker is the United States, and you have seen it very clearly, the back and forth when it comes to the question of the delivering or not delivering of Tomahawk missiles, which the Ukrainians desperately need to come up with more effects on the strategic level, as I have explained to you, because we need a saturating effect on the strategic level against the Russians to force them to the negotiation table. Alone with the assets the Ukrainians have, drones and cruise missiles of the type of Flamingo, for example, that's not enough actually what they need. Okay, let's jump from the strategic level to the operational level. So what's going on the front? As you might know, the front is quite long, up to 1,300 kilometers. Most of you have, I think, no understanding how long the front line is. If you look at the front line in eastern Ukraine, then you can separate the front in the northern part, in the southern part, and in the central part. The main effort of the Russians is especially the central part. The good message I have for you is that also this year, as I have said already in the beginning, the Russians have not managed to break through the defense line in the center of the front. They tried already to do the same last year, but failed, and the same happened also to them this year. But this is now the bad message I have for you. They have improved the situation along the front line significantly. So there are several hotspots. We are talking a lot about Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk is interesting because to the north of the Pokrovsk, the Russians just recently were able to gain momentum. It was nearly close actually that they reached a breakthrough. The Ukrainians were reacting immediately, but it was quite costly for them because they had to bring in already strategic reserves. And this is important. It's not about regional or operational reserves. The first Azov Corps was what I call already some kind of a strategic reserve asset. That means actually it is now fixed because they want to make sure that the Russians cannot come up with a further attack. But it was already quite close in the middle of the summer of this year. And to the south of this breakthrough area, you have Pokrovsk, which we will discuss in a second. Again, here you have a fight for the narrative, who actually is more successful, the Ukrainian or the Russian side. So this is from a briefing of the Russian general staff. You can see here to the north of Pokrovsk this breakthrough, while the Ukrainians, of course, are saying, well, we have successfully managed actually to stop the Russians, which is true. But again, we can also see here both sides are fighting a war in a so-called gray zone, because it's not this classical war which we have seen in the beginning of the war. So tanks fighting against tanks, armored infantry fighting vehicles. No, because of the drones, it's more or less that small elements, small troops of soldiers are fighting each other, which we can also see here in the Pokrovsk area. And unfortunately, Pokrovsk is lost. There is a cauldron to the east of the city. The good message here is that the Ukrainians managed to bring out most of their soldiers from this cauldron and from the city, but unfortunately the city very likely will fall into Russian hands. Why is this important? Pokrovsk is not a strategic city, very important. This is always a hype which you can see in the media. If it's Bakhmut, if it's Avdiivka, if it's Lysychansk, if it's Ugledar, all the cities you have already forgotten. It is an important logistic hub, and it will make it easy for the Russians, especially in wintertime, to have some housing. But it's not that kind of strategic because the Ukrainians have already prepared a defense line behind the city. This is important. I would say there are other hotspots which are more to consider. When you look at the different cities, then you have Kupiansk to the north, Liman, Siversk, Konstantinivka, Pokrovsk, and Novopavlivka, and there are 3 hotspots which I am a little bit concerned of. The one is Kupiansk to the north of the center of the front line. The second one is Siversk. If Siversk falls, then the front might jump to the west, to the direction of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And if the Russians are able to capture Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, then pretty much the Donbass is in Russian hands. And of course, what we also very often overlook a little bit is the situation in Zaporizhzhia. Why is it important? Because in Zaporizhzhia, that is the battlefield of the failed Ukrainian summer offensive of 2023. The Russians try to attack behind the Ukrainian defense lines, direction Zaporizhzhia. And of course, if they manage to do so, and no one knows if they can manage or not, then it will become very tricky. And as you have seen here in the bubble in blue, the question is, have the Ukrainians sufficient reserves, operational and strategic reserves, to stop a breakthrough of the Russians in Zaporizhzhia area? Of course, the Ukrainians are fighting on the so-called inner line, but also here the distances are very big, and we have the problem that the Russians have a very good situation awareness up to 200 kilometers behind the front line. They use what they call the strategic reconnaissance strike complex by using drones, which they use very successfully behind the front lines, and that makes it very easy for the Ukrainians to bring actually the support to the front in a way that it can come in time and come up with the quantities actually which are needed on the front lines. And as you all know, the biggest challenge at the moment for the Ukrainians, of course, are the number of soldiers they have. You don't have these front lines in a way that they are lines. You pretty much have strong points like pearls of a string of pearls, and you have big differences or distances between the pearls which you can overwatch by using drones. But as the Ukrainians say, the Russians are like water. They're leaking actually through all these little pearls, strong points, and come behind your front lines. And this is what the Russians do. At death by 1,000 cuts. They don't care about the people. They just attack wherever it is possible to make sure that the Ukrainians are not able to build any reserves, even if it's regional, operational, or strategic reserves, and to have the momentum with them. And if they have started at one point and are not successful, they just switch to another point, and the Ukrainians are, let's say, have to follow them, and this makes it very difficult for the Ukrainians, these ongoing shifts over big and huge distances, and makes it more easy for the Russian side. There are other things which are very often overlooked. For example, there's a huge pressure on the Ukrainians when it comes to air defense. I have explained to you already that there is a huge need of air defense assets on the strategic level, but unfortunately there's also a huge need of air defense on the operational level. Why? Because the Russians have developed a very cheap weapon system, what the Americans called the JDAM, the Joint Direct Attack Munition, so targeted and precisely usable bombs. The Russian pendant is the UMPK. There is even a rocket-propelled version which just recently appeared up to a range of 200 kilometers. And of course also here you need desperately air defense assets, Patriots for example, to fight against those carriers of those little bombs which are inflicting heavy damage on the Ukrainian side. And also here you see a lot of jamming going on. So if you, let's say, emit any radio signal, then you can actually be sure that you will be hit by a bomb just a couple of minutes later, and that makes it also very difficult. Just to give you an idea, this is the area of Pokrovsk, and the little dots in different colors, these are all the UMPK impacts in 3 weeks. And just imagine you are in one of these strong points with your comrades and are facing this kind of devastating effect on your position day after day. As long as you have no air defense, who can actually bring down the Russian Sukhois, 34s or 35, it will be very difficult over the time. So the good message here is that the Ukrainians are preparing another defense line in the depths with the so-called new Donbas line. You can also see here in detail how they actually try to use the terrain. Just to give you one example from Pokrovsk, so if Pokrovsk falls, there is another defense lines already in the depths. It of course has not the same quality, and this is very important, than the defense line they had in the beginning of the war, because those defense lines were prepared for 8 years, starting from 2014 on. But at least there are some defense lines. And here the same situation, which I have pointed to you before concerning Siversk. If Siversk falls, then the front maybe jumps back to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And you can see that the Ukrainians try to prepare another front line behind those two cities. But if these two cities fall, pretty much then the main bulk of the Donbass is actually in Russian hands. So how do the Russians fight? Very often I think we are falling victim to our own propaganda. Why is this important? Because the Russians are not thumb. They try to do, of course, the best and try to improve. One good example is the use of motorcycles or these Mad Max style vehicles. You call it Zhiguli or Bukhanka. It's not because they are running out of vehicles. No, it's because they changed their tactics and they want to avoid being hit by drones, which is the biggest enemy of a tank today, a drone, a first-person view drone. And even also here you can see that the morale is not that kind of low like we all think. Some of these tactics are actually rooting back to the Second World War. As someone who spends a lot of time in Russian social media, I'm always surprised on what high level actually they're discussing tactics, techniques and procedures. One good example is this little Orbit from the Second World War. It's the Orbit of a Russian, or at that time Soviet, motorcycle reconnaissance battalion. So this battalion had one company of tanks, 10 tanks, and two companies, together 200 motorcycles. So the idea at that time was to reconnoiter actually the German defense lines, to find a gap, to insert the tank company into that gap, to widen the gap, and then actually to break through. And exactly that's what the Russians do, following these old tactics from the Second World War. Just to give you an idea, a typical situation, what we see along the front line every day. On the one side, you can see the motorcycle reconnaissance element before the attack. You can actually look a little bit in the eyes of the Russian soldiers. You see young ones, but also old ones, actually. And this is what is the outcome, finally. After they are hit by artillery, they are hit by mines, they are hit by first-person view drones. So most of them perish, but at least a couple of them, if it's 2 or 3, manage to actually conquer another 500 meters, another 1,000 meters, and they are actually behind then the Ukrainian strong point. The Ukrainians don't know, are the Russians already behind or not, and they have to leave their position. And this is how the Russians actually fight every day along the front line. The next thing is, of course, drones. The last time I was here, I brought a drone with me. That was an old version already. We are building a new one already, a so-called fiber optic guided drone, because the drones, actually, the biggest enemy of the drones were, of course, jamming, electronic warfare. So to avoid jamming today, you have drones which are guided and controlled by fiber optic cables. The distance for these drones, what do you think? What is the maximum distance you can use these drones already by fiber optic guided cables? Some rough guess? Say 2 kilometers, 25, it's 55 to 60. And that broke the neck of the Ukrainians in Kursk, and that broke the neck of the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk. Because by using these long-range fiber optic guided first-person view drones, you actually successfully can interdict the logistic lines. And if you cannot bring out, you're wounded, and if you cannot bring in ammunition, this pretty much is the beginning of the end of a fortress, like it was with Pokrovsk. Also here, you should not forget the coil the coil actually, which is used for these fiber optic drones. Most of them are coming from China in great numbers. And the result is also here that we have a thune of death, pretty much 20 kilometers on each side, where you actually can only go by foot, but you cannot use any vehicles or tanks because you're immediately attacked by swarms of drones, and this is pretty much valid for both sides. And this is why tanks today look like this. You might smile and laugh, but if you're, let's say, facing death, you're coming up with very fancy ideas to survive. And this is why these tanks look like this, and they work like this. Yeah? It looks a little bit strange, like a Madwax vehicle, but at the end of the day, it works. Also here, a video to give you an idea. This is the attack of an Ukrainian fiber optic guided drone against a Russian maintenance point 30 kilometers behind the front line. You can see the operator has a very clear picture on what was going on. So you can fly into the hangar, pretty much have an overlook, look around a little bit. He's actually finding or seeing that there is some camouflage netting to the right of him. So he is actually facing this camouflage net. And as we can see in the next second, the tank is behind that camouflage netting. And you can actually see here there's absolutely no place where you can hide anymore on the battlefield. And this again is 30 kilometers behind the front line. But, now comes the but. This was the first part of the presentation, the visible battlefield. But as we all know, at least on the side of the invisible battlefield, we are all part of a war which is going on, and this is the hybrid war which we see. Yeah? And the hybrid war means that the Russians are following an old strategy from the Soviet times. There are actually 4 phases. The first phase, of course, is demoralization. Sometimes it takes up to 10 years to demoralize a country. That happened in Ukraine from 2004, 2014. Then you have destabilization. Just look or think about Maidan and what happened later on when the crisis broke out, the invasion of the Russians, not only of Crimea, but also of the eastern Ukraine. And finally, the normalization, which is in Soviet thinking, the intervention and the bringing of the country back to the place where they think they should belong. And this is actually what is happening. And you should understand that the KGB at that time was not doing what you have seen in James Bond or something like this. No, most of the time it's about influential information, it's about cognitive warfare, and this is actually also valid for today. So you can also see here that when it comes to drones, for example, some countries are already coming close to a crisis. Just look at Denmark, because out of the sudden you have a lot of drones flying around. That doesn't necessarily mean that every drone is flown by a Russian or with someone who has a Russian connection, but you have fear, you have anger, and you have questions. You have the question, why can we actually not secure our own airspace? Oh, we have sent all our air defense assets to Ukraine. Shouldn't we stop that? So this is exactly how it works. And if you look at the billboard, then you can see what is the target of the opponent. And the target of the opponent is to make sure that the people are not believing their politicians anymore, not the military. Because someone is saying, well, this Mr. Reisner is a NATO troll. Actually, we cannot follow him because he's telling us completely nonsense. And just to give a little bit an idea, I will go through these slides from August to November this year. So you can see hacking, you can see actually sabotage, you can see sabotage in the waters, you can actually see drones flying around, you see that spy ships are going around, you see that obviously cognitive warfare is a huge topic, you see that generals, politicians are actually really are reluctant to believe that something is going on in a way that no one is believing them anymore. You see sabotage in a way that there are kinetic attacks, like you look at Sweden or at France, where you can see that obviously it was a tactic to use pig heads actually to place them in front of mosques. Or I guess you know the story of the German Bundeswehr, the German Bundesmarine, who just recently lost nearly 3 ships because of sabotage, not because of Russian torpedoes, but because of Russian sabotage. The DHL situation where actually it was planned to smuggle explosives on board of planes. Drones again. Some say the Russians are already here, they're just waiting for the order to do something. And of course I would agree with von der Leyen when she says we are actually facing a hybrid war and we're already part of it. And it's not only around, and this is especially valid for the Austrians, but also in Austria where this comes to the game. And you can see a lot of different things which out of the sudden are connected to the situation when it comes to hybrid warfare. And just recently we saw again the little green man at the border of Estonia, not because they wanted to invade into Estonian territory, but just to spread fear and anger and confusion, and no one actually was knowing what they were doing actually there. Well, and once again here, to the Austrians around, and I have not translated this, so you can read through it. It's very clear where we are and on what side we are actually standing as part of the member of the European Union. So if someone actually is hurting the international law, then we have to act according to the international law. And it's interesting to see that Medvedev obviously also started already to threat Austria. So the Chancellor is completely right when he says they are testing us. So at the end of my brief, I only would like to give you 3 scenarios how this might end at the end of the day. So there is, of course, the Korean scenario, which is already heavily discussed all over in the different circles. There is the German scenario and there's the Finnish one. The Korean scenario would mean there is only a ceasefire. There is no peace, it's only ceasefire like it is today. But Ukraine will lose significant amount of terrain. As you might know, the Chinese peace plan divides the country along the Dnieper. The Russians would be happy with that, but they're saying, well, Odessa would be nice for us too. On the other side, we also have the German solution. The German idea has one advantage, because as you all know, Western Germany was part of NATO. So that might be something which, at the end of the day, would be very useful for Ukraine, but at the moment is not on the table. And of course, the Finnish scenario would be that, of course, Ukraine will lose some territory, but as it was with Finland, Finland was becoming stronger after the so-called Winter War of 1939 and 1940. And as we all know today, Finland is even or already part also of NATO. Well, that would conclude my brief. I would like to say thank you very much. I was restricted to 50 minutes, so I think I'm perfectly in time. And if there is anything we have to talk more in detail about, or if there's any question, please feel free. Thanks a lot.
So, Colonel, thank you so much for your briefing, for your presentation. And I hope all of you are a little bit exhausted, because there was such a lot of information.
I hope not exhausted, I hope thrilled.
Such a short time that nobody really can wonder. But the outcome that you can see is the whole complexity of such a war. This is not just a situation where you find, I don't know, a few hundred tanks on the one hand and a few hundred fighter aircraft at the other side or whatever, and okay, then look at what is going on. But it has become such a complex situation that it is enormously difficult to have a clear picture. Therefore, I really want to thank you. We do have the advantage that Colonel Reisner not only studied his military field very intensively and practiced it, but he also studied history and philosophy. And therefore, maybe his looking behind the scene is in the same way important for getting a clear picture. Okay, I would like to start with a few questions, and maybe then afterwards we go also into the public if you have questions, because of course there are many open things. Yeah, the one thing is we have learned so much about the new warfare. You talked about the drones. I mean, there are some analysts that tell us that within those 4 years or 3.5 years of warfare now, we had different phases. It started with sort of a blitzkrieg at the beginning, then it became a conventional war with artillery and tanks, and then it changed. It became a war of drones, completely new for everybody. And of course, it's also a war of attrition, just as we had it also in the past. And it is very hard to tell what is the outcome. First of all, I want to ask you the following question. You mentioned that Ukraine has already to introduce its strategic reserves. We have learned, of course, there is a front line of 1,200 kilometers. This is something that is not only for big countries, but also for very big countries, a challenge. And we have learned also that the Russians do have problems to have enough soldiers in the field. Not just by chance, they imported soldiers also from North Korea and so on. So far, maybe can you tell us a little bit about this? We are talking now also in Austria. Should we prolong the military service from 6 months to 8 months? Because the Germans are talking about reintroducing also obligatory military service. So maybe can you tell us a little bit about this personal situation?
Okay, first of all, I would like to say a few words about the situation concerning the technologies which are used in Ukraine in this war, and what kind of effect they have actually, and how we should look at this. It's heavily discussed, for example, if there is an evolution of warfare or a revolution of warfare, which is in academia a hot topic. I would give you the following answer. When it comes to the technological side, it's still an evolution, but there is already a revolution going on because it's so cheap actually to produce a drone and to mass produce drones which you then can use actually. That makes a difference. And there is not a single conflict at the moment where drones are not used. You might have looked a little bit what happened in Syria, when the regime actually collapsed, but this was done also interestingly with the help of Ukrainian drone operators who actually used first-person drones against Syrian strongpoints, and they just collapsed, and that changed the whole situation. So this is something I would like to emphasize, that we have to think always about it. And one last sentence to the drones. Drones are nice and have a huge effect, but at the end of the day, you need a soldier, a human soldier, to occupy, to liberate, whatever you call it, terrain, and to hold the terrain. The drone cannot do this, and also the robot will not be able to do this at the end of the day. And this is where the problem starts actually. The Ukrainians can hold back the Russians by using a lot of drones, but at the end of the day, they need soldiers to fight in strong points, to counterattack and things like that. And that makes a difference. So that brings us to the point of the question, should we have a voluntary service or should we have conscripts? I mean, just take the German Bundeswehr. What is the size of the German Bundeswehr at the moment? Do you have a number in your head? It's the first time it's below 180,000. It's 179,000. And what is the plan for the German Bundeswehr? 260,000. So what is the gap? What is the delta? What is the missing number? It's 80,000. So where are these 80,000 soldiers coming from? I don't see any recruitment stations run over by people who want to volunteer like it was during Ernst Jünger's time. So somehow the state has to come up with a solution, and of course it is the solution to conscript, to go back again and to have conscripts. And so we can be very happy in Austria to have conscripts, not only to fulfill the task we have actually reserved for the military, but of course also what we need actually in the social system. I personally think at a certain point we will have a voluntary 1 year service for human in a way that they are not only males, but also females, for example. So in a time of crisis, if you ask the young possible conscripts if they want to serve, you will get the answer, no. So you have to force them in a way, in a positive way, because you will not get the numbers together. This is unfortunately the truth, because it's not only in Germany, it's all in France, it's all in all the other countries. So maybe you have the situation where you have a low income rate, which actually also brings a little bit more soldiers to the ranks, but at the end of the day it is like that. And it was always in history the same, that you have to force the youth when it comes to this certain point in history, that they actually are called to the weapons and do what it is necessary to defend the country.
Yeah. let's go back what you mentioned about the drones. Everybody is fighting with drones. I very often tell this personal experience I had some years ago in Kurdistan, in Iraq, when I visited the Peshmerga troops, and I met the commander and asked him, what are the biggest challenges for you? And he said, drones, tunnels, and snipers. This was around about, I don't know, 7 years ago, where nobody talked about drones, and they showed me then, you know, also the drones they had. This was a in China produced drone, bought in a toy shop in Berlin and brought to Iraq and used over there. And at the same time, they had the other side dig tunnels. I very often thought, you know, also in the Gaza war about this situation. And of course, also the question of snipers, which means high precision weapons. I mean, if you generalize it. And insofar, of course, you wrote a book and articles about the battlefield out of glass, you know. Certainly this is the answer. The answer is to go underneath, on the one hand, and try at the other side to fight against drone. Now we could read just 2 days ago that Rheinmetall has developed a new laser weapon, a new laser pistol against drones. Maybe you tell us a little bit about the warfare and perspectives out of it.
Okay, first of all, once again, also to explain a little bit more in detail the phenomenon of drones. First of all, you have to understand that the military is thinking in different domains. So you have the land domain, you have the maritime domain, the air domain, you have the space domain, you have the cyber domain, the information domain, and you have, of course, the electromagnetic field. And in each of these domains, you can have autonomous systems. Even in the cyber domain, you can have autonomous software programs who are doing some stuff for you, like a drone. But of course, drones are important when it comes to land warfare, when it comes to air warfare, and also maritime warfare. You should not overlook that the Hamas, for example, used underwater drones against Israeli rigs a couple of years ago, which is unbelievable, because the Hamas actually was facing a very strong sanction regime, but they managed to build these little drones because you can do it actually when they have a little bit of technical understanding. So the thing is, when you now go back a little bit more in detail, for example, on land and air warfare, then you see that on the strategic, operational and tactical level, drones can also have an effect, because on the strategic level, it's a very cheap asset which you can use to conduct strategic air campaigns. And that makes a huge difference if you're facing hundreds, even thousands of drones, because you need a lot of ammunition to bring down those drones. One of these Garand 2 drones costs about, what would you say, how much money in euro? Let's say between 30 to 40,000 euro. How much costs a Patriot air defense missile? 600,000 upwards, becoming more and more expensive, because they're produced by private businesses and they all want to make money, actually. If you have shares, you would understand. So this is one of the problems. You can have a saturating effect by using cheap drones. On the operational level, this is what I have told you before, you have this strategic and operational reconnaissance strike complex. So you have drones who are forming this transparent battlefield. So everyone knows what the other one is doing. And this is, by the way, the case why this war is going on in that way like we see it. This is the paradox. It's the same like you had in First World War. In First World War you had concertina wire, trenches, and machine guns who brought both in a situation where no one actually was able to conquer terrain anymore. And it was the tank which was actually used to overcome that situation, that stalemate. And today, in the 21st century, you have pretty much the same situation, but because of drones. So everyone knows what the other one is doing. You cannot actually stage any troops, you cannot go into maneuver, because immediately swarms of drones will destroy your vehicles because actually of this transparent battlefield. And on the tactical level, like I have explained to you, we have very, very cheap possibilities to destroy heavy armor. one of these drones, actually, this first person drones costs about 300 to 400 euros, and you can destroy a 3 to 4 million euro tank, even a Russian tank costs that much actually, and that makes a huge difference. And this is why drones have this really devastating effect on the way we fight wars. And also here to the Austrians, you cannot just say, well, we don't want to have anything to do with those drones and the military should not use any drones. If you do it like that way, then you will fail. So you have to explain to your military how these drones work and how you can fight against them. And now comes the laser into game, because the problem with cheap drones is they always can have this saturating effect. You can mass use drones, you can use swarms of drones. And if you have a drone swarm, it's very difficult to fight against the drone swarm. You need a very fast acting weapon, and what the military is hoping is that the laser will be one of the answers to fight against those drones. A lot of people were thinking maybe it's the control of the electromagnetic spectrum, so if you can span the drones, but if they are coming on cable, as I've told you before, if there's a swarm of cable drones, then at the end of the day you need kinetic means. The best would be the laser because it's going so fast actually.
Yeah. Maybe let's stay a little bit with the drones, because I think this is a new factor, and everybody also can learn a little bit out of it. I mean, it's not so long ago when the first war really was fought by drones in Armenia.
Some even say in Libya already.
In Libya already, okay. And then it has developed that in the first phase of the war in Ukraine, I had the impression that it was rather an advantage for the Ukrainians, but very soon the situation changed and the Russians became strong and stronger. Ukrainians had more or less the Turkish systems, Russians overtook the Iranian system and developed it further. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about this development within the war. On the warfare of drones.
I think, if I'm right, I was here 1 year ago or 2 years ago already, and I brought a drone with me, if I remember that correctly. That was one of these first-person view drones. I was very proud of it, because at that time we started to build it on the Academy to show the cadets how this works. But if I would bring drones today, this is already an old version, because I have already the fourth drone, which is the modern one actually. The newest one is the one with fiber optic guided coil, which is actually wired. So the first one I showed you at that time was an analog drone. Then the development was to a digital version with a higher range, then an improved one with a higher range and more resistance against jamming. And the latest version is the fiber optic guided drone. And this within pretty much 1 year. So it's said that every 2 to 3 months, everything is changing completely, which is an absolutely overflow for regular militaries, because if you start to procure a certain drone type now, then you will have it in 3 years. And in 3 years, this drone you can actually throw away, because there's already the newest type, which is scratch built even better than this drone.
Yeah.
That is where the revolution also comes into game a little bit.
Yeah. Maybe a last question from my side before we go into the public. You also mentioned these different versions, how this war could end, whether it was the Korean solution or a German solution or the Finnish solution, whatever. You are also a historian. You are looking at the situation with military eyes, but also with historian eyes. How do you see the development? How do you see how the two sides are acting just in the perspective of ending a war? I'm asking this because, I mean, after 3.5 years of warfare, it is immense, the damage for both sides. Just think over that the Russian losses are around about between, I don't know, 700,000 and 1 million killed and wounded soldiers, probably at least 200,000 killed soldiers. This is more than they had for the invasion army at the beginning of the war.
Regular forces.
So far, these losses must have an effect. And of course, also the political effect, economic effect is there. So far, your view on the situation.
Also here I have to state once again, the historian will tell you after the war why it happened exactly in that way and why it was done in that certain type of solution, whatever it was. I think there are certain things we have to understand. First of all, once again, it's not only about Ukraine against Russia or Russia against Ukraine. There are the supporters in the background, like I have explained to you by referring to the boxing ring, and that makes a huge difference. If there is no China, if there is no India, who is buying a lot of resources, if there is no North Korea, just to elaborate a little bit on North Korea, you might laugh about North Korea. Okay, what the hell is about North Korea? But the North Koreans have delivered in the last 2 years 6 million artillery shells. The Russians are producing 3 to 3.5 artillery shells a year. So if you put that together, you have between 12 to 13 million artillery shells. And that makes a big difference. The West have delivered to Ukraine in 1 year 1.4 million artillery shells and in the other year 1.3 million artillery shells. So this is a quarter of what the Russians, together with the North Koreans, had available. And maybe the North Koreans were in the medieval times, but the Russians are bringing them now to the, let's say, modern times because of the supplies and all the resistance they get. Yeah. So that makes a big difference. And also, when you look at countries like Turkey, for example, because when it comes to the supply of certain goods, then all the towns or in this Turkey, they can act in a way which is then very helpful for Russia. And on the other side, you also have the Ukraine, which managed to have a success in the beginning and was helped a lot by the West. But also here, you have to understand if the West ceases the help, then Ukraine is not able to fight the war anymore. Because it's a war of attrition. It's not about sophisticated, nice, fancy gadgets. It's a war of attrition. So it's about industrial production, for example. And that makes also a huge difference. And also here you can look at both sides at the conflict. You can say on the one side, okay, look at the Russians. The Russians haven't managed until today to conquer Ukraine, which is true. But you can also say, look, the West, with all the mighty military power of the West, hasn't managed to corner the Russians until today. How could this be? How could it be that the mighty Western militaries were not able to corner Russia? Because it's about boiling the frog, not to escalate too much. So at the end of the day, as long as both sides are supported, the war will go on. There's only one resource which limits both sides, and this is the sheer number of human beings which you can force to fight for each other. So this is the number of soldiers pretty much at the end of the day. So when we now consider this situation, then we have to say as long as there is support, the war will go on. And we don't know actually if it will end next year or in 2 years. It's very unlikely that it will take 10 years or even 5 years, but the war will go on as long as this is necessary. And you can actually see that the kingmaker, Trump in that case, somehow is already in a desperate mood because he wants to end the war. I think he's honest in that, but he has no idea how to do so. And the Russians, why should they negotiate? Why should they? Because they think they're on the Silo Heights and look direction Berlin. Doesn't matter if General Zhukov lost another 100,000 soldiers. And it's even said that the Russians need the knife on the throat to actually go to the negotiation table and talk to the other one. And this is not the case. And if you have heard, President Zelensky, a couple of days ago, I think it was 14 days ago, said very clearly, I will accept the ceasefire line along the current front line. So he already offered a lot to the Russians. But have you heard anything from Putin that they are ready to negotiate? Have you heard a single word, a phone call between him and Trump? No, there was nothing. That is the problem. Rybakov just recently said the war will end in the time when the Baltics are NATO-free. That's quite a message, I would say.
Yeah. Okay, now it's up to you to ask the one or the other questions. Please, Mr. Ambassador. Yeah, just a moment. The micro, please.
You were speaking about the subtitle of your presentation is status quo. What is, in your view, the status quo of the cognitive warfare going on now?
Well, if we refer once again to these 4 phases. So there's the one phase, it's called demoralization. then there is the other one which is called destabilization, then there's crisis. Crisis means there is already action on your territory, and then there is normalization, which is intervention. So what would you say, like, let's say Austria, in what phase are we when it comes to cognitive warfare? Is everything fine? The state is working well, we believe in our politicians, everything is nice, the military is doing well. So are we outside these 4 phases? No, we are not. So I would say it's somewhere between demoralization and destabilization. In Germany, for example, I would say you have already destabilization. When you look at all the things I have shown you when it comes to hybrid warfare. I can elaborate a little bit on the German Bundesmarine, what happened to them, because it explains very clearly how hybrid warfare is defined. And you also have already crisis. Look at Denmark. Why was it Denmark, by the way? Because the Danish said, okay, we can offer to the Ukrainians to build up factories in Denmark to produce military goods for Ukraine, and out of the sudden the drones were coming. Again, not all the drones which were seen were flown by Russians or Russians-related persons, but the big question was in Denmark, okay, how to handle this? What can we do pretty much? Where are our air defense? All this kind of stuff. So this was already crisis, I would say. So I would give you back that answer. It's becoming more and more tricky, and we already, let's say, at least in one of the early phases of these ways, the Russians or the Soviets at that time inflicted high casualties by using these phases of hybrid warfare.
Okay, now we go to the center over here in the 3rd row, yeah.
You yourself said that when supply is missing, the 2 parties would stop the war. And when you look at the supply behind, you see the BRICS countries, which own most of the energy resources in the world, and also natural resources, and high-tech supply, and the West has to buy a lot of this. What is your perspective with that in mind?
Well, I would say that the global south has a huge opportunity in their point of view to change the way of the world, I would say. So everything is rearranged in their opinion. And again, if the Chinese foreign minister is coming to Europe and telling you, we have no interest that the Russians are losing the war because then we might face the United States, I think everything is on the table then. There is nothing to hide. I would not say it's correct to say, well, the Chinese, I mean, they also have no interest and so on and so on. Just look around a little bit what's going on. And don't forget, when you look at the Chinese, they have not forgotten what we have done to them in the 19th century. You just have to look at the Opium Wars. There were 2 of them. So they have not forgotten this, actually. And then you have India, for example. So we always say the rule-based order. So there's the UN Charter, there's the UN Security Council. Does India have a seat in the UN Security Council? No. But these are 1.4 billion people. And they also want to have a voice. And the Indians are saying, India is saying, well, Great Britain, what the hell? I mean, this is a joke. They want to tell us what we should do. Yeah, you're laughing, but it is exactly like this. Once again, India, 1.4 billion people. China, 1.4 billion. As an Austrian, just take the numbers. 1.4 billion, just write it on the wall. Then you take 9 million. So these are the inhabitants we have in Austria. Then cross out all the zeros. And then you have a clear understanding what is your relevance. It's very low. I think you all have seen the visit of the Indian foreign minister in Austria, I think 2 years ago, and the interview with Armin Wolf in the ZIP 2. When Armin Wolf was telling the Indian foreign minister, why are you not supporting the sanctions? And the Indian foreign minister said, well, listen up. If you now can to a cheap price buy goods, it's perfect. And if we can sell these goods to you to the double or third price, it's even better because it's now our turn. Well, everything said, I would say. So if you now look at the world as a huge chessboard, and if you're the king on the one side, on the white or on the black as a Chinese, then you can figure out what kind of figure maybe Russia is for you. Because Russia is one of the most resource-rich countries, and it's more or less on your side. If you hear from Trump that he's telling Putin, listen up. When we have a deal, then we can together explore the Arctic region. Then it is more or less the idea from the Americans to get the Russians away from the Chinese, to face the Chinese. So this is really grand strategy, actually, by the way. Yeah. But this is the situation. And they have prepared themselves for centuries, exactly for that moment.
Okay. Here in the center, the lady, please. Yeah. The micro, please. Yeah.
So given all the challenges the Ukrainian army has faced or will face on the front line, and you pointed out that you need soldiers, not only drones, to just not conquer or defend, just hold an area. Do you think that the Ukrainian army is getting along without any intensified mobilization?
Well, this is a very delicate question because you're talking about young boys of the age of 18 to 24, which you actually send to the trenches, which are facing agony and terror. And especially in a country where this number of people is a very low one, because these are the kids of the time of depression, pretty much. Yeah? So there are not many of them around, actually. And this is why I think Ukraine still hasn't mobilized these soldiers from the age of 18 on. It's tricky. There are a lot of others coming in. So the highest contingent of foreign soldiers in Ukraine is especially from Colombia, for example. So there are several thousand Colombian soldiers also fighting there, like the North Koreans on the Russian side, by the way. Yeah. But I think we have to understand that at the end of the day, the number of young soldiers is a number which is more or less limited at a certain point. And this will also give you the answer as a politician how long you can fight the war at the end of the day. And as you have seen, in all the three scenarios, which I not have personally invented, these are the scenarios which are discussed in Washington, for example, and even in Brussels, there was one thing in common. In all three scenarios, Ukraine has lost territory. And it's very unlikely, if there is no black swan event or whatever it is, if there is no Lenin going to Russia, whatever it is, that Ukraine has all the resources it needs to liberate or to free all these occupied territories again, because then they are facing the exact situation like the Russians do at the moment, because then they are the attacker and the Russians are the defender. And we have seen how this looks like in 23 in the failed summer offensive. It doesn't mean that it is not possible, but it's not possible in the way we're doing it now, to give them a little bit, to keep our morale high, but not what they actually need to make a difference.
Fehlinger, I guess maybe a question concerning NATO. Okay, micro, please. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. It's only peripherally connected to NATO because obviously I'm for NATO membership of Austria and Ukraine. But my question is, Mr. Colonel Reisner, you have quite missed one of the optimistic scenarios, maybe a fourth scenario, the scenario of the liberation of Crimea, after now winning basically the battle of the Black Sea and the battle of the air war and also the energy battle, which Ukraine has all won. Why is it not possible in your scenario also to really have the liberation of Crimea and then the complete collapse of the Russian forces in Ukraine and a very much a victory scenario as well?
Sure, you're absolutely right. This is one of these black swan events, what I have told you before. This is one of these events you will have hundreds of books about then, and everyone will tell you why it was very clear that it happened exactly like this. We're just looking at the facts at the moment. Of course, the Ukrainians have driven back the Black Sea fleet in the Black Sea, but this war is fought on the land. It's a land-centric war, actually. This is where the war goes on. It doesn't have necessarily to do with what is happening on the Black Sea. And if the land domain falls, let's say to the Russians, then automatically the sea will also fall to the Russians. So I would agree, everything can happen. Maybe tomorrow, as I told you before, maybe his name is not Lenin again, but someone actually goes into a train, the train is sealed, and he goes direction Moscow, and then 2 years later we will hear after the sudden something happened. And everyone will tell you that it was very clear. I don't know it. As a military person, I only have to look at the facts, what I have, and I don't have to think, I just have to assess. This is what I have to do. And this is what you actually expect me to do to you.
Yeah. Now we go to the other side. Yeah, please, the lady.
From my experience with the Austrian Army, and I think it's the same in other countries, but we have a special situation because of our so-called neutrality, which just is for Russia a chance to use us as a bridgehead and not as a builder of bridges or a meditator or whatever it is called. We are a bridgehead, as I said, and there is much of Russian subversion and infiltration also in the army, and there is nothing ever done to fight this. This we can do and we have to do. We can do it at once. It is not done. When we used to talk about the front in Ukraine, and there are people dying for us, and they need better weapons and they need better drones. But we have a front here, and the front is also that some institutions, also political parties, are undermined to extent that we could call it a front organization. This affects the army heavily, this affects everything heavily, but there's nothing done against it. And I stumbled more or less about this, first in the Green Party, and later on I had to do with the time when Norbert Dauer was the defense minister.
Not a second
and
presentation.
He was sealed off
Short
and
question,
under surveillance.
End your sentence,
yes,
and please
I experienced that the chain
answer.
of command in the Austrian army is undermined by somebody. Is it undermined by Russia?
No, please get the micro away. This is not possible. Thank you very much for your interest, but this is a little bit too much. Maybe we can find a way to give an answer for the essence.
I give you no. Let me.
Maybe if you want to leave the room, please leave the room. This is a solution, but
I would say as long as a person like me are responsible for the training of young officers, I think you can sleep very well. That's it.
Okay. So, yeah. Now we have two more people. Maybe let's take two questions. Kettler is the first, and then, okay.
Yes. Colonel Reisner, thank you immensely for your insights. It's very rare that we have the opportunity to listen to somebody on this issue who is so well informed and is prepared to give us so much information. My name's Ron Willis. I'm president of the Club of Commercial Councillors in Austria. Might be of interest, I originate from New Zealand. Just on the point before, as just a little insert, you mentioned combating drones with lasers. I imagine there must be a weather limitation on that. But my questions now, because I have the opportunity to ask somebody who has detailed knowledge, one side is a compound question on aircraft, and the other side, missiles. There was a big issue quite a long time ago about providing Ukraine with F-16s. My understanding is they have been provided with some. What I'd like to know is a bit more detail, how much, but more to issue. Are they turning out to be of use? Are they being used? Do they have more potential to be used for other methods in the future? I also believe the Ukrainians have been talking to the Swedes about supply of Saab fighters. How's the issue on that? On the missile side.
Please, no further presentation. That's what I asked. This is not only for the lady, but the same way for you. Thank you. I think very short, the question, and then the next one.
On the missile side, will the Germans, in the end, provide Taurus to Ukraine? And on the other side, how are the Ukrainians getting on with developing their own? And is the West actively assisting them to do it? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe we take another one, Kettler.
If I can answer it immediately, because I'm actually, it's already late. It's my 5th presentation today, and I'm forgetting what I was asked. So first of all, environment, weather has a huge impact, also on drones. So you have success if you attack in the morning using the morning fog, for example. That makes a big difference. And this is, of course, also a topic for a laser. A laser works perfectly well in Israel, but it might not perfectly well will not perfectly well work in Europe, for example, especially in a time like we have at the moment in November or December. So concerning the F-16, it's like if you want to take part in a Formula One race, you need a Formula One car. If you don't have a Formula One car, you can also drive around a little bit close to the race, but you will not be part of it. You can use it, but you cannot use it actually on the race on the court itself. Yeah. And I would not like to go into detail, but there are certain assets which you need today in modern warfare, and especially in modern air warfare, which are not available. And this is why they use what they do with at the moment. For example, they are using F-16s to intercept drones, for example, very successfully. But they are very seldom used for dogfights, for example, because the Russian planes are in a way sophisticated, and they are again also a little bit upgraded by Chinese assets and so on and so on. And Taurus, well, this is a political question. I cannot give you an answer on that. I think you all know why the Germans are not delivering Taurus. This is something related to certain restrictions they have, and if in the end this will happen, I don't know. But the same question would be, will the Americans finally deliver Tomahawks? How many? Okay, we'll see. I don't know. There were a lot of red lines in the beginning of the war. So at the beginning it was about helmets, flak jackets, and now we're already actually delivering cruise missiles of the type of Storm Shadow and Scalp. So maybe we will see some further things in the future. But again, the thing is we're discussing it over months. Should we do it or not? So the other side can prepare for it. And when they are then finally arrive, then in very small numbers. And this has not this kind of saturating effect which you need. You need this kind of saturating effect, and you need measurable results. Okay?
Okay, yeah. Now, Kathleen.
Thank you very much. Lawrence Kettle, I'm a research associate with the AIES. Actually, it's a follow-up question regarding the Tomahawk cruise missiles, because there are two aspects you've mentioned in your presentation, which was fantastic, but one that was saying that it's a war of attrition and won't be won with just fancy gadgets. But you also said the Ukrainian army needs certain things to make progress on the battlefield. Now, at first, that might seem logically inconsistent, but it's not. So I wanted to ask you, if Tomahawk cruise missiles are delivered, what actually will it make a difference in terms of the Ukrainian advances? Or is it just another one of these toys that will slightly shorten what is proving to be already a war of attrition? Thank you very much.
I would say it's a question of quality and quantity. Yeah? We already have a situation where we have good quality, but we still lack the quantity. Yeah? If you just deliver, let's say, 100 Storm Shadows, that makes no difference at the end of the day. Yeah? You need 1,000, and you have to use them in 2 or 3 weeks, and then you have that saturating effect I'm always talking about. Yeah? That makes the difference. Yeah? The good thing is, at the moment, on the strategic level, you see that the Ukrainians have success which you can measure by using different types like drones, and I haven't given you the answer on the Flamingo and their own cruise missiles, but of course, these are fancy weapons, but they're not this kind of sophisticated like a Taurus or a Tomahawk. I mean, these are high-level, tier-1 weapon systems, which you cannot just scratch build. Yeah? So it's also a question of numbers. This is why this is a war of attrition. Yeah? If you use 1,000 cruise missiles in a very short time frame against logistic basic of the Russians, you have an impact. I'll give you one example. There was one weapon system who made a difference for a couple of weeks. I guess you all know it. What was the type of it? In 2022. No. Very famous. The HIMARS, right, the HIMARS. The HIMARS was a really nasty surprise for the Russians because the Russians have prepared their logistics in accordance to the strongest Ukrainian weapon. And that at that time was the BM-27 Uragan and the Toshka-U, which is a ballistic missile. So they had their logistics out of the range of these weapon systems. And out of the sudden, Mr. HIMARS came into the game and entered the chat, as it is said. And HIMARS was able to fight or to hit targets on a range of up to 70 kilometers. And that was a shock for the Russians, because Russian logistics is organized very simple. You have huge numbers of ammunition boxes on one place at that time. So 1,000 tons of ammunition in one place. So one HIMARS hit had a devastating effect. So it took the Russians nearly the whole summer to rearrange the complete logistics system. And this was exactly the time when the Ukrainians had their success at Kharkiv and in Kherson. And that was the moment when the Russians were really cornered. That's what I have told you before, when later on then the Russian Dunkirk happened. Yeah? But today it has changed. What is the problem? The Russians brought over the last 2 years a lot of fancy gadgets into the game, especially when it comes to electronic warfare. So I give you one example. There is one artillery shell which we are very proud of. It's called Excalibur. The Excalibur is an artillery shell which actually can pinpoint strike a target with a hit range of 97%. That was a perfect weapon in the wars of Afghanistan and Iraq, because you had minimal collateral damage and you really shoot the hell out of the Taliban somewhere in a hideout, wherever it is. But facing an opponent which is a near tier 1 level opponent, like it is with Russia, the hit rate went down to what percentage? What would you say? What do you think? From 97% to 6%. And it's the same with the HIMARS. For let's say 4 rockets, there it's only 1. It's the same with Storm Shadow and Scalp. So the nasty surprise for the Western weapon systems, or for the Western weapon system producers, were that the electronic warfare means of the Russian side had a huge impact. And we still have no real answer on that. This is why we have, by the way, fiber optic guided drones, which were invented by the Ukrainians, copied by the Russians, and produced by the Russians on a high scale, because they use industrial assets to do so. So it's quality and quantity. And if you don't give an answer on both, then it's difficult.
Yeah, there was a lady over there. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this intriguing presentation. I just want to have sort of a provocative remark and a question regarding the title of Future Perspectives. So when you said Russia lost again the summer offensive, and also Ukraine is bringing the war back to Russia, but both, to be honest, did not have any impact for the regime in Moscow. So it's still stable, it's still there, and it's transforming from an authoritarian regime to totalitarian regime. So my question is, what is our answer, instead of just doing wishful thinking, saying, okay, this is bad for Russia? What is our answer to having Putin establishing a regime which we're not getting just rid of? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I mean, this is actually the question I'm always asking. So I'll give back the question to you, because this is the right question. I mean, the situation at the moment is perfect for Putin. Approval rates are up to 80%, and this is no fake news. It is really like this. They're doing it very clever when it comes to Russian propaganda, because they're not saying we are fighting the Ukrainians. No, the West somehow have twisted the Ukrainians, and it's the West who fights against us. The same way like the fascists have fought against the Soviet Union. And this is the point where the great patriotic war comes into the game. And even if you're, let's say, not a fan of Putin, at the end of the day, we'll say, well, it's about Russia. I mean, if it's about Russia, then we have to do all together something to make a difference. And you're right, it's always about control, and Putin has perfect control over the people, of the periphery, maybe even a wider area. Of course, you're right. And it doesn't matter if he's a slave of China, for example. For him, it's perfect. And we still have no answer on that.
Yeah, thank you. There was the lady over here. Yes, the first one with the hand open.
Thank you very much for taking the question in advance. I promise to be short. All the technical details are a little bit above my head, so I'd like to come down to the human level. Earlier on, I would have asked you, what role do human resources play? You covered it already. So I have a much more basic question, coming down to training in Austria. What strategy do you use to entice people, young people, to join the army?
This is an absolutely perfectly well asked question. And what can I give you as an answer? I do what I do. I mean, I'm giving briefs, I'm going around, I'm trying to attract the people to serve for the country, to bring something good into the game. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to immediately fight with your weapon in the hand on the front lines. No, it's about the state. You should trust the state. You should bring something on the table as a young soldier at the end of the day. So you just can do it by doing it on your own in a way. Yeah? And I think we are doing not so well, because when it comes to information warfare, and I'm part of information warfare in a way, I think you all know me, and I think you, hopefully, all of us still think that I'm a normal person, and I think you trust me in a way that you can give me your young sons, even daughters maybe, and you can hope that I will do the best out of it. And I hope not that I have to lead them to the front lines. No, this is something I want to avoid. I also have 3 children. I have 2 sons. When I train my cadets, I do it in a way that I know that when in 5 years they are company commanders, and my sons will face them, hopefully I have given them everything with them, that they will act accordingly the rules and will treat them well. Yeah. So we try to do it in that way, and it's not easy, yeah, because we have a society which is a post-heroic society. The Ukrainians and the Russians are heroic societies. You should not forget that. Yeah? That makes a big difference. We have a post-heroic society. So the question is not what can I do for the state. The question is what can the state do for me and my family do for me, and father and mother, what can they do for me? And I think we have to change this. I can tell you stories, unbelievable one from my time when I was commanding the Guards battalion in Vienna, but this actually will I think I'll stop here. It's better.
So, okay. The last 3 questions. The first is Christine Mutonen. Please come here in the first row, then you, and then the gentleman over there.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. I'd just like to know, how real do you think is the nuclear threat?
Also, this is a very, very good question, and a very delicate one, because there are 2 camps. Yeah? So the one camp is saying, well, this is just a threat from the Russians. They will not do this. And by the way, it's not the Russians alone. It's also the Chinese and so on. And the other camp is saying, well, we don't know. At the end of the day, we have to come up with some risk management. And I've given you the examples. So the United States, the Biden administration took it really serious what happened in summer 2022. You can read about it in the books, how they actually did the phone calls. The Joint Chief of Staff of the United States to the Chief of General Staff in Russia. So Mark Milley to Gerasimov, the defense ministers who talked to each other. This happened once in summer 22. It happened a second time when the Russians were using the Oreshnik. Also here we had these phone calls, which is, by the way, a really good message to you. It has changed compared to the 60s and 70s. Yeah? In the 60s and 70s, no one actually was knowing what to do, or where's the phone which we have to use in case of we have to talk to Khrushchev or Kennedy, whatever it is. So the good thing is today, if something happens, if there's a rocket just out of the sudden on the radar, phone calls will start. Yeah? Very intensive to make sure that nothing bad is happening. Yeah? But again, there are certain means which you can use. It's, of course, the nuclear field. It's also what hybrid warfare can come up with. You can inflict mass casualties in a very easy way. Just think what happens if you have a blackout, things like that. And this actually keeps everyone at bay, I would say. Yeah? It makes a difference. Yeah? And of course, you can say, well, we don't care about it. We just go all in. It might happen that it works. And the Russians will say, okay, I'm sorry, this is the knife at my throat where I now will back off. Or you will not have the possibility to talk about it anymore because the world will go down in flames. I don't know. Europe. This is something which has changed in 1945 after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's still the case that atomic weapons have changed everything, unfortunately. And we are going back into a Cold War 2.0 when you now have heard that the atomic weapon testing will start again. There is the Poseidon, there is the Oreshnik, and so on, unfortunately.
Okay, yeah, over here. Micro, please, yeah.
So first, in your opinion, what are the Austria's new responsibilities in the European security architecture? And the second question is, how should be the so-called geistige Landesverteidigung of today in the situation a significant part of Austrian citizens have so-called migration hinterground, and huge part of Austrian residents had no Austrian citizenship. Thank you very much.
Also, this is very, very interesting what you're asking, because it's especially related to the Austrians who sometimes think they are, let's say, on another planet. And they don't care what happens on this other planet, actually, in another sun system, whatever it is. How should I take the question? When it comes to geistige Landesverteidigung, so this, let's say, comprehensive approach when it comes to national defense, I think we are doing not so bad in a way. I think I'm a good example for that. So when it comes to the point that we really try to inform the people in an objective and neutral way, I think we're doing not so bad, I would say. You can tell me the difference, but I think you all know me, so somehow you can actually trust in what I say. We have a very good training and education. It's not that I'm the person I am because I'm Mr. Reisner. No, it's because I'm the product of a good education and training. You spend a lot of money for our education and training, so this is what we can give you back now at the moment. So this is our contribution on that. Of course, the problem is a little bit that the Austrians are not willing to accept what is happening. I'm always bringing the following example. Just imagine, okay, so who of you have children? I guess a lot of you. So I have 3. Okay, so you return from your work in the evening. You have tried to rescue the world during the day, and you're really exhausted, and you come home back, and the family is waiting for you, your children, boys and girls, and your wife, and you have dinner together, and you think, wow, I'm so happy I have my family, and at midnight you go to bed, and you think, okay, now I have 6 hours, my 6 hours just for me, and I can sleep to be a Superman again tomorrow, okay? And then out of the sudden, at 2 o'clock in the morning, your little son or daughter comes to you and whispers in your ear, Daddy, I think it's burning. And you think, what the hell? Has someone said to me it's burning? And you look to your wife, but your wife is snoring. And then you think, no, it was not true. It just was a dream. And your little child is saying, no, Daddy, I think it's burning. The house burns. And you say, Jesus Christ, until the moment you smell the burn. And then you jump out of the bed, you take your kid, you wake up your wife, and you try to rescue the house. But at the moment, we still think it is a dream. And the blanket which keeps us warm, the Russians provide this blanket because they want to keep us in bed. They don't want that we look around if there is a fire or not. And this is what I want to explain it to you. It's so difficult to understand that it's getting serious. Now should be the moment where we jump out of the bed and tell our little child, okay, let's look, where have you smelled the burning house, whatever it is, just to check if everything is fine, and then you go back into the bed. But this is the problem, why it is so difficult, because a lot of still say, especially in Austria, it doesn't matter what's happening in Ukraine or somewhere else. We haven't started this. Please, Colonel Reisner, stop. I don't want to listen to you. I don't want to hear this. The world is nice. Give me a coffee and a croissant, whatever it is. This is the problem. And we have to overcome this, especially also in Austria. And I don't want to talk about neutrality, all these kind of things, which are also of importance. But I think the more you're affected, the more you're willing to invest and to sacrifice also something. Because what we think is granted is not granted. The way that everyone actually, if you can sound off and can stand up and say, Mr. Reisner, what you say is completely nonsense. I will leave immediately the room and nothing will happen to you. Nothing. There will no police car standing outside and actually put you in handcuffs and bring you away. What might happen in other countries, what we have to say. So I would give you that answer on that a little bit. It's changing. It takes a little bit longer, but I think there is some progress at the end of the day. And I believe in the Austrians that at the end of the day, if they want to make a change, then they will do a change actually, which is necessary at a certain point.
Okay. The very last one. The very last one.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. As an American and former military and having made 4 trips to Ukraine and traveled around quite extensively, more first for curiosity, and and since I realized there was a direct train from Vienna to Kiev leaving every day, I said, this is interesting. So started my journey. Traveled around quite extensively, and two quick observations and a question. One, I found that there were many competing interests going on. You got a geopolitical thing going on. You've got economic. A lot of people are making money off of this. So you got these interests, these huge interests that sort of are propelling this conflict, and you've got some other issues as well going on. And I couldn't find really many Ukrainians willing to, die for the struggle on this. They weren't interested. And
please,
as an American,
could you ask your question?
The Americans aren't
the
interested.
The last one, you should.
The Americans aren't interested in dying or going into the struggle. Do you think the Europeans, when push comes to shove, are ready to go to war against the Russians over Ukraine without American support, which I'm pretty certain is not there? We might provide some munitions and ammunition, but we're not going to put any troops on the ground for that. Do you believe that is the case?
Okay, thanks for the question. I mean, the question we can answer in that way. As long as the house is not burning, no one is willing to leave the bed. This is the problem. But let me say something about the Ukrainians. I had the honor to command the Ukrainian contingent in Kosovo in 2021. 70 soldiers, 6 of them officers. And I spent really a lot of time with them. I was one of the lonely soldiers actually doing so, because most of the people were not interested in them. But they saw that this Austrian is actually interested in the situation in Ukraine. Why was it the case? Because at that time I was commanding the Department of Research and Development at the Academy, so I invested a lot of research already in what was happening in Ukraine in 2014 and 15. So we spent a lot of time together, and of course the one another vodka was also drunken. But the thing is, every one of them was a very admirable young soldier and officer. First of all, they said, we want to be a part of Europe because there is the money. This is why we want to be part of Europe. We want to have a better life. What should we do with the Russians? We only have a very, very complicated past with them. So we want to change. And you have this fancy idea of Europe. This is very, very nice to us. So that's the first thing. The second one is, it's very interesting always that we tell the Ukrainians what they should do. I think the Ukrainians can decide on their own what they are willing to do or not. And if they are willing to fight, then it's their right to do so. And maybe at a certain point they will say, okay, we have to stop now because we're running out of people, and they will stop. But it's not on us to tell them what they have to do, especially not on the Austrians, because the Austrians always say, Jesus Christ, I mean, it's becoming bad for us, because the Ukrainians don't stop to fight. I mean, what the hell? What are we talking about? And just to give you an idea, from the 6 officers I was in contact with, and these 6 actually introduced me to a lot of other officers, because every 14 days I actually phoning them and ask them, okay, how is it on the front line, and so on and on. Of the 6 officers, there is 1 missing in Bakhmut, a city no one knows anymore. 3 are killed, 1 lost both of his legs, and the 6th one is mentally done. So this was what they did for their country. And I think at least at the end of the day, that will give them my respect, at least.
Okay. Thank you so much, Colonel Reisner, for your presentation and for your really very, very open answering all the questions. I think this is really a model that not easy to copy. To find somebody in uniform who comes really from the very business, who is in an official function and who is ready to speak out so openly all the questions, not just making very diplomatic answers, but really going very straightly into all those causes. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward for further opportunities in the future. But of course, I guess you will be interested maybe to hear what will go on tomorrow. I think we can offer you not only highly competent persons. One of them is sitting in the first row, like President Lukashenko, who led the Orange Revolution, who used to be not only the president of the National Bank, but prime minister and president in the most difficult situation. So far we can learn a lot. On the other hand, we have a person like Chancellor Schüssel, who also is very open and has an experience far beyond anything. We will have the chance also to listen to Benito Ferrero-Waldner, who not only was the Austrian foreign minister in probably the most difficult period of Austria's foreign policy, but also used to be the representative, the high representative foreign minister of EU. And she can tell us maybe a little bit about this dilemma between national state and the Union. And we really have best experts from Germany, from France, from Brussels, from anywhere, former foreign ministers and other ministers, as I can see over here. So far, it promises really to be highly interesting. We will start very early, already at 9, but we also will end soon after noon, which means at 1:30, 1:45, there should be an end. So far, I only can invite you very heartily to come tomorrow to listen, and I guess we will not only be confronted with the challenges, but maybe also learn a little bit about at least some answers for the challenges we do have. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very good night.
Super.
So, just a moment. At least one bottle of wine for